I did that for 5 days, an hour each day. And on the seventh day, I did the performance test again in just running shorts and a singlet. And at the same heart rate of 135 beats per minute, I was running quite a bit faster. So anecdotally, I saw some performance improvements in just a week. And for someone like myself, a midlife runner that's time crunched, unable to recover from additional mileage, or more high intensity efforts, I think doing some heat training could potentially give us a bigger performance return on the time invested. So to take the next step down the heat training rabbit hole, when we say heat training, what kind of temperatures are we talking about? Then most runners think about their training in terms of mileage, intervals, long runs, maybe even strength training. Not so many actually think about environmental stress as a training tool. But heat training could be an accessible and evidence-based performance lever available to any recreational runner, albeit a very uncomfortable one. Before we get into the science and protocols, could you share with us who Dr. Daniel Snape is, your background, and how you got into the field of heat and hypoxic conditioning?
Yes, thanks for having me on, Justin. So, yes, my background is I'm a sports scientist and also kind of an environmental physiologist. So studied kind of through university, kind of undergraduate sports science, masters exercise physiology, and then I guess it was the PhD where I started to specialize, particularly in heat acclimation. So my PhD was around acclimation strategies for competition in hot, humid environments. So I had a very specific focus on the Tokyo Olympics. So at that time, kind of when I started, the Tokyo Olympics were kind of 3 years away. So my research was embedded into kind of British triathlon and kind of looking towards Tokyo around different heat acclimation strategies. So my PhD was developing a few different heat acclimation approaches for triathletes. We developed like a heat stress test as well. And through my PhD, kind of worked as a physiologist for British triathlons, would deliver some of the, sub-max, VO2 max profiling assessments. If they had certain races that were in hot places, we'd do some heat training. So we've got an environmental chamber over at Leeds Beckett University. So now I've moved into a bit more of a consultancy role. So I do kind of like at the Health and Performance Hub at the university, we deliver heat training for external clients. So people doing marathon disables, Bad Boat 135. So a lot of amateur recreational ultra runners will come and use our facilities. So we've got a kind of water immersion lab as well. So we can do kind of hot water baths for people. There's some altitude and a range of different services that we can do as well.
Who were the athletes you worked with in the Tokyo Olympics?
So we worked mostly. I worked closely with Jonathan Brownlee. So he came to me to kind of develop a heat acclimation plan and put together a protocol for that. But during that period in the lead up to that, I'd worked with all of the Leeds-based triathletes. So Georgia Taylor Brown, Jess Lermouth, Alex Yee when he was a student at the university. Sam Dickinson as well, who's on that kind of Olympic program.
And what about now? Are you working with any top level athletes?
So working with Tom Evans, so just recently been doing his kind of altitude plan and kind of helping support that in Leeds. So there's myself, Paul Booth and Dr. Barney Wainwright putting together his altitude plan. But I guess moving towards, he'll maybe look to go to UTMB again this year and defend his title. So last year we worked with him in his heat and altitude, as well as Ruth Croft as well, kind of helped give some advice to her.
Okay, so you worked with the 2025 UTMB winners, Tom Evans and Ruth Croft?
Yes, two big names. Very fortunate to work with both.
Fantastic. For listeners who have never considered heat training as a deliberate strategy, can you give an overview of what it is and how it can benefit a runner in their 40s, 50s, maybe even into their 60s?
Well, I guess it's quite important for us to kind of distinguish between, heat training and heat acclimation. So they're kind of used interchangeably. And I think what we're referring to when we say heat training is probably doing heat exposure to improve performance in cool conditions. Whereas I'd say heat acclimation is kind of artificial heat exposure. So that's environmental chamber, or it's using saunas, hot baths, training wearing thermal clothing to improve performance in hot conditions. And then there's heat acclimatization, where you go on a warm weather training camp or go to a hot country. So I think if we're focusing on heat training, that's something that the kind of recreational runners can do through saunas and hot baths that they can access either at the local gym, or they can do hot baths at home in the house, or they could do training around thermal clothing. So there's a lot of evidence to support heat acclimation to improve performance in the heat. And I'd say it's a bit conflicting whether it does improve performance in cool conditions. To kind of dig into that a little bit more, the research was suggesting that that kind of plasma volume expansion that we get from heat training would then increase the kind of blood volume and then downstream increase your maximal oxygen uptake, so your VO2 max, through that increase in blood volume. And then that would then relate to an increase in performance because we're able to deliver more blood, more oxygen to the working muscles. And that was the idea around that famous kind of 2010 paper, which funny enough was done in cyclists, and they showed an increase in VO2 max and an increase in time trial performance. But then there was a couple of studies that followed that up and said, actually, we've repeated the same test. We've shown that VO2 max increase like you did, but we've not shown that time trial increase in time trial performance. So there's been, since about 15 years ago, there's been back and two kind of, it does improve performance in the cool or it doesn't. And now you've got the hemoglobin mass benefit from this prolonged heat training. So I guess that's heat acclimation over like 1 to 2 weeks. And then there's the heat training over 5 weeks that is now showing to increase hemoglobin mass. But there's yet to be any kind of performance data to support it'll improve performance yet.
Okay, so based on the research, we see an improvement physiologically, but in the real world, there isn't anything to really confirm that is tied to actual performance in the cold yet. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll get into the exact physiological adaptations a bit later. Personally, I've done a heat training block before, and it was a miserable experience. But despite that, I actually personally, anecdotally saw an improvement. It was a short block, it was about a week. So what I actually did was I got on a treadmill. I used the first day as a pre-heat training performance test. I was wearing just regular running shorts and a sleeveless top. I got into my zone 2 heart rate ceiling, and for me at that time, it was about 135 beats per minute. And then I marked the speed I was running at that heart rate. Then for the next 5 days, I overdressed with like 5 layers of whatever I could put on myself, with a beanie and a neck scarf and gloves. I looked like a complete idiot running in the gym wearing that. And of course, my heart rate goes way up at the same pace. I did that for 5 days, an hour each day. And on the 7th day, I did the performance test again in just running shorts and a singlet. And at the same heart rate of 135 beats per minute, I was running quite a bit faster. So anecdotally, I saw some performance improvements in just a week. And for someone like myself, a midlife runner that's time crunched, unable to recover from additional mileage or more high intensity efforts, I think doing some heat training could potentially give us a bigger performance return on the time invested. So to take the next step down the heat training rabbit hole, when we say heat training, what kind of temperatures are we talking about?
So depends on the mode of heat training. So essentially with all of them, we're trying to increase our internal core body temperature to at least 38.5 degrees Celsius. Or because as we acclimatise, it becomes more difficult to get there. So, or on the other hand, maybe a degree above our resting. So if we have an ability to measure our core body temperature and it's like 36.5, we might want to get it 1.5 degrees above from that, which would take you to 38. Whereas if you come in at 37, then we're aiming for 38.5. Because if you're at 36.5 and then you're trying to get to 38.5, that 2 degree increase is really difficult, and that's where it becomes a really hard session because you're having to do a lot of high intensity efforts to raise core temperature up quickly. But ultimately 38.5 degrees Celsius, we're trying to get there within 20 to 30 minutes and then keep it there for around 45 to 60 minutes. But it's important to say also that skin temperature is quite critical and that we want to get our skin temperature to at least 36 degrees. And we're trying to narrow that core to skin temperature gradient as much as we can. And that is what is giving us the stimulus from an internal heat production perspective. And then there's stuff around the plasma volume and the fluid loss that we'll touch on as well that's important. But I think they're the two key ones. And then as long as we're sweating quite heavily, that is then linked to that plasma volume fluid loss that we'll come on to as well.
Well, let's go into the key adaptations now so the listener can have a better idea how significant they are individually and combined. You mentioned plasma volume, so let's start with that. What is it and what happens to it after a heat training block?
So essentially, plasma volume is an increase in our blood volume. So when we heat train, we sweat, we become dehydrated, we increase our kind of plasma osmolality, the concentration in our blood, and that puts stress on our kidneys. And our kidneys are, not thinking about performance. They're trying to, protect the kidneys. They're trying to maintain blood pressure. So it's that initial plasma loss, so that fluid loss, that increases the concentration of the blood, increases our hematocrit levels, and then our kidneys are then responding to that by secreting certain hormones, so like aldosterone, vasopressin, that then actually mean that the kidneys retain that they kind of retain sodium, and then kind of water follows sodium. So then by that we retain more water. So that increase in plasma volume is an increase in the water compartment of our blood. So our blood's made up of like red blood cells and water, and it's that increase in water because we're retaining more sodium.
Okay, so essentially we're getting a bigger blood volume in total, even though the concentration of the red blood cells in that volume of blood is a bit lower in this case.
Yes. Yeah.
What about hematocrit? What is it and how does heat training affect that?
So that's the red blood cell compartment of the blood. So like I said, when we exercise and we lose fluid, we sweat, become dehydrated, initially our hematocrit will be increased because the water component's dropped. So our body is then trying to get that back to normal levels around kind of 45%. So that's done by either just rehydrating or actually, like I said, that sodium release that makes us then retain more water in the future. But it's that repetitive, repeated, drop in plasma volume and increase in hematocrit that is causing that EPO stimulus that I guess we'll come on to that is around the using heat for altitude benefits or that kind of cross adaptation.
When hematocrit increases during a heat training block, is it just an increase in percentage of plasma volume or is it an increase in the absolute amount of hematocrit in our body?
So it's initially it's just an increase in concentration, but then through weeks and repeated, in changes in that concentration, we get that HIF1 alpha EPO stimulus that will eventually increase our red blood cell production. That will then increase the absolute amount in the kind of. So with altitude training, we get that within about 3 weeks. Where with heat training, we've shown that about 5 weeks of that repeated increase and decrease in our kind of hematocrit and plasma volume will eventually then promote those red blood cells that will then increase our hematocrit weeks down the line.
Okay, with regards to plasma volume and hematocrit, is the goal of the heat training block to increase total plasma volume and the absolute amount of hematocrit?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so we want both sides to go up in absolute terms, not just as a percentage.
Yeah, well, the volume's quite like transient that it'll kind of increase very quickly within like 4 to 5 days, and then it'll then come back down unless we do controlled hypothermia where we're constantly forcing that adaptation. So we've shown that if you just did 5 days of heat training, like I said, it would eventually expand and then it would return back to normal levels. Whereas if you do a kind of isothermic clamp, which I can describe what that is, that 38.5, we've shown that can sustain the plasma volume expansion for weeks.
Okay, we'll get into how long it lasts and the protocols a bit later. But let's talk about the heart. Does heat training affect heart rate and stroke volume?
It does, yeah. So through 2 mechanisms. So we get in that kind of increase in blood volume. I guess we take a step back. When we do heat training and we put stress on the body, so it stresses our cardiovascular system, and to compensate for that, you've probably seen it where if you run at the same speed, your heart rate's higher in the heat. And that is because your body's shunting blood to the skin. There's less blood in central circulation. So to compensate for that, we increase our heart rate. And then it's after 4 or 5 days when we get that plasma volume expansion, we increase the blood volume so that if some of the blood's going to the skin, we've still got a similar amount in central circulation, so that our heart rate is then back to where it was in cool conditions. But we've also shown that actually we can change the kind of structure and size of the heart as well through heat training, kind of similar to like you would just through normal endurance training. So we get kind of adaptations to the heart structure itself, and then also the increase in blood volume that will then help reduce the heart rate in the future.
Okay, I've mentioned that I've tried a heat training block myself, and at the same pace, my heart rate was way higher. If I remember correctly, it was about 160 to 170 beats per minute when my normal heart rate would be about 135 beats per minute at that pace. 160 beats per minute would be about touching zone 4 for me, and 135 is zone 2. So pace or power wise, I was in zone 2, but cardiovascularly, I was in zone 4. So what zone was I actually training in during those heat sessions?
Well, you kind of answered your own question in a sense of that you were kind of mechanically in zone 2, but cardiovascular wise in zone 4. Now, then there's a different question of maybe what was the muscle, what zone was the muscle you'd use to measure the lactate? Would that suggest you're in zone 2 or zone 4? And expect it to be closer to zone 2. But we do find that in the heat, there is that preference for your body to switch to carbohydrate oxidation to become more glycolytic. So there's likely a slightly elevated production of lactate. So it might have suggested you're more in zone 3 if you to measure, to look at the muscle stress. I think, like you said, mechanically you're still in zone 2, but your heart rate's elevated. So I probably would ignore heart rate and go more off pace and mechanical stress, and know that heart rate will come back down after a couple of sessions. It'll come back towards what a zone 2 heart rate would represent.
Yeah, exactly. So if my memory serves me right, the first day I did it, it was closer to 170, and as the days went by, my heart rate started to come down, and the amount that I was sweating also changed. So on the point of sweat, how does heat training affect sweat response?
Yeah. So it's the key adaptation really, alongside that plasma volume expansion. So plasma volume expansion is key, and it comes quite early, and we see that drop in heart rate. Part of it is just familiarization as well, that your body's in that initial survival mode, so that our kind of sympathetic nervous system is firing, so our heart rate's elevated because we're just like, oh, this is stressful, what is this? And then the plasma volume will help compensate for that. And as you become more familiar with the environment, your nervous system's not firing as much. And then if we think about 80% of our heat loss is through sweat evaporation. So as I mentioned before, that shunting of blood to the skin, that's only effective if we then sweat effectively at the skin layer, because it's the water molecules that are on the skin. It's the evaporation of the water molecule that loses heat energy. If that water just drops off the skin, so whenever you've been training and there's a puddle of sweat below you, that is inefficient heat loss. So like I said, around 80% of our heat loss is from sweating. So we want that to be as effective as possible. And like you said, it does take a little bit longer. So the plasma volume changes are quite quick, 4 to 5 days, we'll see an increase in that. Whereas sweat evaporation, around 7 to 10 days, we'll start to notice. And then around kind of 14 days, it'll become optimized. It depends where the athlete's coming from. If you're endurance trained, which you described that you are, a recreational runner. So most recreational runners will have a slightly elevated sweat rate just because throughout the week when they're training, if there's any sessions where the core temperature gets high, they will be sweating. So the average person who doesn't train might have a sweat rate of about 0.5 to 0.8 litres an hour, whereas an endurance person may already be at a litre an hour, and then keep training will then advance it even further.
What about core temperature at a given exercise intensity? Does heat training actually help our core temperature stay lower at any given intensity?
It does, yeah. So
Okay.
we'll start to notice again with about 5 to 7 days that our resting core body temperature will be lower. So our body's shifting its set point for when we start to. So those thermoeffective responses, that increase in skin blood flow and sweating, they will happen at an earlier core body temperature. So we're trying to increase our heat storage capacity. So if we're starting at 37 and we know it becomes life threatening at 40.5, if we can lower our core body temperature to 36.5, we've got another half a degree before things get. And some athletes will find, around 39.5 that it might then really severely impact performance. So again, if you can start lower, you've got longer before you get to that high core body temperature that's either going to drop performance or could be life-threatening if it progresses further.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So it essentially increases the range of body temperature that can fluctuate before your performance drops, right?
Yeah.
Okay. For VO2 max, you mentioned that heat training does move the needle on VO2 max. How does it actually happen mechanistically? And in terms of percentage, how much increase in VO2 max does heat training actually elicit without actually doing VO2 max workouts?
If we're looking at the heat training in terms of the 5 weeks of passive heat training that's quite popular right now, there's a nice review article that shown will increase. Yeah, so our plasma volume will increase by about 5%. That'll increase our blood volume, and that will increase our VO2 max by about 3. So if we've got a VO2 max of like 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute, so that's relative to our body weight. So the average person might be about 40 if they're kind of like a gym goer, runs once a week, and someone that's a bit more endurance trained, doing 2 to 3 sessions a week, maybe trains for like half marathons, maybe in like the 50s. I'm sure most people have some sort of idea of that from the kind of Garmin or the watch they're wearing. So they increase it by about 3. The less trained you are, it probably increase it more because you've got more of an adaptation potential. Whereas someone that's very highly trained, who's up in the 60s, may only see 1 to 2, percent increase. So I guess it depends on the context of your training status. But there's 2 ways of improving it. Like I said, there's the blood volume expansion, or with the heat training over 5 weeks, there's then that hemoglobin mass increase of about 3 to 4%. So there's increased blood volume, but then also within the blood, an increase of hemoglobin that can carry the oxygen. We'll increase our blood and oxygen delivery to the muscle through. And that's why we need to be careful of splitting the two. There's heat acclimation, which is the blood volume, and there's heat training, which is the hemoglobin mass increase.
So basically, the mechanism whereby VO2 max would improve is through the delivery of oxygen to the muscles. Is that how it works?
Yeah.
Okay. And let's talk about erythropoietin or EPO. You mentioned earlier that one of the effects of heat training or hypoxic training is for the body to upregulate its natural production of EPO. So for someone who doesn't know what EPO is, could you explain what EPO is, how it improves performance, and how heat training upregulates the natural production of EPO?
So EPO, I guess mechanistically what's happening, it's something we've touched on a few times, is around that when we heat train, we lose fluid through sweat, we become dehydrated. And also because we push blood to the skin, what it's doing is it's putting stress on the kidneys. So there's 2 ways of thinking about it. There's one where the lack of blood flow to the kidneys is increasing, it's creating a hypoxic environment in the kidneys because it's getting less oxygen delivery. So the kind of blood vessels around the kidneys constrict, and that's where there's the drop in blood flow, reduced oxygen delivery, and it creates a hypoxic environment at the kidneys. So that stimulates something called HIF1 alpha that will then stimulate this hormone called EPO that the kidneys will then produce, and that will then produce more red blood cells downstream. So again, through heat training of several weeks, that continuous stimulus of EPO will eventually produce new red blood cells, and that EPO produces new red blood cells from the bone marrow. So that's how we're getting that HB mass increase from the heat training, the passive heat training over several weeks. And then, like you said, I'm not, obviously well aware of the EPO, use that was very famous in the kind of 80s, 90s with professional cyclists. They were essentially, like you said, taking some blood out and then letting the body actually produce EPO naturally, but also they could have it synthetically as well, like you suggested. And then it comes back to that increased oxygen transport that will then help with performance.
Okay, let's double click a bit on safety around heat training, because if it's done wrongly, it could be potentially life-threatening, right? So my first question with regards to safety is, Are older athletes more vulnerable to heat stress than younger ones?
Yes, we know with age that your kind of sweat response is a bit delayed. Your kind of like skin blood flow response isn't as good. So yeah, you're a little bit, those thermoeffector responses that are crucial to losing heat are a bit delayed, is a way to think about it. So the initial rate of heat storage is higher in an older athlete. So yeah, but saying that, there's also still so many factors around, your body fat, any health complications, um, your training status. So it's not to put people off who are older from being worried about the heat, because as humans we're very well adapted to heat versus say cold stress or altitude, and that if you're fit, healthy, you're endurance trained, you can still manage the heat quite well. And a big part of it actually is behavioural. You know, applying common sense. And you'd like to think someone with a bit older age, wiser, would have, right, I'm not going to try and push for a PB because today it's 35 degrees and it's not sensible. Versus someone that's like 18 and it's the first half marathon and they're trying to, so probably they're more susceptible in the heat than an older athlete who's maybe experienced it before and had a few run-ins with the heat.
How would you recommend someone measure their core body temperature safely so they don't overcook themselves when they're racing in the heat or trying a heat training protocol?
Yeah, and it's very important because obviously within a university, a lab setting, we've got specialist equipment that is validated for measuring core body temperature. So the most popular is a rectal thermistor probe that we get people to kind of self-insert, and that's our gold standard. But I guess what's accessible to people, if we want something valid, core temperature pill would be the most accessible, but it can be a bit cost prohibitive because the device itself is going to cost you around £1,000. The core temperature pills are going to cost you about £60 for one pill, and that's single use. Or it might stay in the kind of intestines for 2 days. So yeah, it looks like a red and white pill, much larger than like say a paracetamol tablet, but still manageable to kind of swallow.
So it goes down this way and not up the other way?
You can do it the other way if you want to, but most people will just swallow it. And then you need to allow then sufficient time for it to get through the stomach. And then the kind of gastrointestinal tract is homogeneous in temperature. So as long as it can be in that kind of system for around 5-6 hours, you can get a core temperature reading. So it's been used mostly in the field. So when researchers have looked at like the thermal strain of a marathon race, it's got someone to swallow a core pill. So if we're getting then to what's a bit more accessible, is probably either one, the tympanic monitor.
What was that, sorry?
A tympanic monitor.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Probably hard to describe without showing you kind of like a picture, but a lot of like parents may have bought one for their child if they've got like, a cold or, high temperature, and you kind of put the tympanic monitor in the ear canal and you can get an instant reading. The challenge is it's not a valid measure of core body temperature, but I still use it quite a lot in practice because I think it gives you a good indicator of how hot you are, but it's then working within safe limits, because for something to be valid for core temperature, it needs to be measuring within about zero point 0.2, 0.3 degrees, whereas we know with the tympanic monitor, it could be as much as zero point 0.4 or zero point 0.5 degrees away from what actual core body temperature is. And it depends a bit on the environment you're taking it in. It's not very good if you're like a cyclist or a runner and you're outdoors and you're trying to measure it then, you get a lot of cooling just from the wind and the conditions on the kind of the neck and the head there, so it won't really give a valid reading. But if you're doing some heat training indoors in your garage, in your conservatory, on a treadmill, there's not much wind movement, it will align quite well with what your core body temperature is. But I'd set some quite clear thresholds of, if that tympanic monitor is measuring 39.5, you probably need to stop there because it could be 40 and you get quite safe limits. And then there's the core sensor as well that's quite common now.
Yeah, I got it right here. This one, right?
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So again, I really like it because it's compatible with a lot of different devices. It gives you a live reading that you can display on like a head screen, or you can connect it to your phone or an iPad, so you can see a live reading. But again, the research is showing that it's not a valid measure. That can be as much as like zero point 0.4 degrees out. And I've shown that all the time in my own lab as well, where we're measuring rectal temperature against the core sensor, and it's zero point 0.5, zero point 0.6 degrees away from what it actually is reading. But I think for heat training, if you're just trying to get yourself to around that 38.5, I think as long as you know that's around 38.3 to 38.7, you kind of know you're in that zone. Because again, if we come back to like training zones, they're quite broad, aren't they? And I think with the heat training, we can be quite broad on with a 38 to 39, we're in about where we need to be. And kind of worrying too much about point 0.1, point 0.2 is not important. But like I said, if it's getting to 39, 39.5, we just need to be really careful that it could be actually under reading what it actually is.
Okay, what's the maximum core body temperature that would be safe? Is it 39.5 degrees Celsius or is it 40 degrees Celsius?
Depends on the individual. So exertional heat stroke, which can be life-threatening, can happen at around 40.5 degrees internal body temperature. So we really don't want to be getting close to 40 because it could be. And with the thing with heat as well is that there's always a delay, a lag. So if you see 40 on your core sensor, even if you stopped there and then, if you didn't apply some cooling, your core will continue to rise still. So it's that kind of caution of that.
Okay, so I guess when it gets to 39.5 degrees Celsius or 103.1 degrees Fahrenheit, it's when the athlete should start pumping the brakes and dial it back down. Is that correct?
Yeah. But there's no benefit of being extra hot. We've shown that in the research that 38.5 versus 39, it's not like a dose response of, oh, well, I'm hotter, so it must be better. It's actually you're cooking yourself. It's almost like treat yourself like food a little bit. You want to be nice, golden brown. You don't want to be kind of burnt to a crisp. Like think of it a little bit like that. You don't need to kind of tough it out for the sake of it's better. It's actually no, just keep yourself in a good area where it's very hot, and like you described it when we came on the call, it's not nice at all. It's never going to be like, oh, this feels, if you're warm and you're kind of comfortable, it's probably not doing the job. Whereas if you're, hot and quite uncomfortable, it's doing what it needs to. But then if you're very, unbearably hot, very uncomfortable, you're probably too hot. And I think those perceptual readings are very important, just as much as the core temperature reading, because, like I said, with those core devices, I don't know how much I trust them because I use them all the time in the lab, and some of the time they're quite way off what it should be. Whereas I think your internal perception is very important to try and calibrate that. If it's unbearably hot, it probably is too hot, and let's back off the intensity a little bit.
I've also heard that it is not very accurate in giving you the precise core temperature measurement, but it is very useful for telling you how much your body temperature has risen from the time that you started. And you can use that as a benchmark. For example, I've gone up by 1 degree Celsius or I've gone up by 2 degrees Celsius, and that's where I should stay around before I start bringing it back down, correct?
Yeah, about that, yeah.
Okay, so duration-wise, you said that it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to get to 30.5 degrees Celsius or 101.3 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
Okay, and how long is the minimum time that someone has to stay at 38.5 degrees Celsius or slightly higher before they actually get some kind of benefit?
And flip it on, like, how many sessions do you plan on doing? So if you're only going to do maybe like 4 sessions total, you probably need to, spend at least an hour at that 38.5. Whereas if you're going to do maybe like 8 to 10 sessions across 2 weeks, you might be okay with then doing 45 minutes. So the dose, think of it on like the total dose pre and post and how you split that up. Within a single session, though, you don't want to be getting there in 20 minutes and then spending 10 minutes there. And that comes back to the challenge of some of the passive stuff of people may only go and sit in a sauna for 15 minutes. But then if you only get to like 38.5 at those 15 minutes, but then you get out, you've had like either 5 minutes or no time at that 38.5. So it comes back to, again, making sure the sauna's not too hot or the bath's not too hot, so you can, when it gets to the temperature you're trying to achieve, you can actually then tolerate that heat load for a sustained period. But that's why the passive stuff is very good, because it will actually get you there very quick. If you can get there quicker, get there quicker. Like we did it with some of the marathon guys, where we did only like a 45-minute session, but it meant we needed to get them to temperature within 10 minutes. So the initial starting point might be we're doing some really high intensity sprints to get there. Whereas if you're thinking today, I just want to keep it a low zone 2 run, you probably need to allow a 90-minute session. So with the triathletes that we've worked with, we tend to go off that 90 minutes because they just cycle at a low intensity for 45 minutes. Because some of them have just come in off a 3-hour ride and then they've now got a 90-minute heat session. They don't really have it in them to kind of be doing high intensity efforts. But if today you're a bit time stuck, you might go, no, first 10 minutes, I'm going to do some really hard efforts to get my core up really quick. And then I can really back off the intensity then and just keep it low.
Got it. And what's the maximum duration that someone should stay at this 38.5 to 39 degrees Celsius? Is there a maximum safe limit per session?
You probably, 60 to 75 minutes is going to be more than sufficient, because then you're then starting to think about, well, I've been sweating for 2 hours, fueling requirements. So you're trying to then think probably afterwards, have I got another training session that day, or a hard session the following morning? There's probably then implications on, fueling and hydration, and how, if you're doing like a late night session, are you going to be able to rehydrate and fuel before you go to sleep? So there's other considerations more than what's safe to be at 38.5. It's like, well, what's the impact on the larger goals?
And are there any specific health conditions or medications that would make heat training totally dangerous or unsuitable for the individual?
Obviously, the obvious, if you've got any kind of cardiovascular, kidney diseases, you probably might want to manage and speak to a doctor about, is heat training safe, because it's going to put additional strain on my heart and my kidneys particularly. If anyone's got any kind of nervous system impairments, any disabilities in that perspective in terms of their spinal cord, you're probably more at risk because your sweat response might be delayed. Any particular drugs, again, anything that, so NSAIDs, so like ibuprofen, paracetamol, are generally kind of advised not to have before any heat training, or if you're going to do like a race that's in hot conditions, we're kind of advising people not to have those painkillers, because they can impact the lining of the stomach, they can delay the sweat onset, they can kind of alter your perception where you think you're not as hot as you are, and then you push yourself harder. So there's a few little things around that as well to be considerate of.
And also probably when someone is having a fever, they shouldn't be doing it, right?
No, probably not. Because we've shown in the research that people that have exertional heat stroke, they probably had some sort of underlying illness, respiratory infection in the days leading up to it. So you might not be full blown super ill, and you're like, obviously, of course, then you'd be like, it's not suitable for me to race. But we know that there could be something in your immune system there where it's not showing itself, but that will put you at increased risk of heat stroke or heat illness.
What about hydration? What would be a pre and post hydration protocol for a heat training session?
So I guess that's where, trying to develop a bit of an individualized hydration plan. So knowing, through the heat training, your first block is going to be quite exploratory, where you need to measure your body mass pre and post and account for fluid intake and do some sort of like sweat loss calculation. So you can start to track, like you did with your heart rate, what is your sweat loss? Is it a litre an hour? Is it a litre and a half an hour? And then you can be a bit prescriptive on, within the session, if I know I lose a litre an hour, well, I'll try and drink a litre across that hour. But again, it's so niche in terms of understanding, can you actually tolerate drinking that much fluid? You might be someone that doesn't drink too much, and suddenly having that much fluid is going to cause you some GI distress. It's probably more in the kind of pre and post heat training session that's critical, and that actually during it, just try and drink to first, really. And then actually pre is where you maybe do a bit of, and it's not excessive. It could just be 500 mil in the kind of 2 to 4 hours before your heat training session, and that you maybe have 300 milligrams of sodium. So that could just be one tablet in that 500 mil of water. And then again, it's probably then post that is quite critical. And again, that's why body mass is nice, because you can weigh yourself at, say, 70 kilos. And then the next morning, if you plan to do another heat session, have a look at your morning body mass. Did you get back to 70? If you're at 68.8, you know that your hydration post wasn't sufficient. Because if that's going to continue throughout the heat training block, you could become quite exhausted and dehydrated and worn out the other side. I've probably seen a lot of people do that where they don't get the rehydration between sessions right.
I've heard that it would be advisable to drink 1.5 times the amount you lose in sweat during the session. So you weigh yourself naked before the session, and then weigh yourself again after to see how much weight loss there was. So for example, if it's 1 kilogram of weight loss, assume that it's a liter of sweat loss and drink 1.5 times that amount. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the general kind of rule of thumb of guidance around that. You try and replace 1.5 times what you lost. So like you said, a litre, then a litre and a half. It's kind of quite easy maths. But it's important that some of that comes from food as well, and that you are either adding sodium to your diet, so having foods high in salt, or adding a bit of salt to your food itself, or just having some sort of like electrolyte. Milk's a bit more rehydrating than say water is.
Okay, is there a time window after the session is completed that someone should have that 1.5 times of fluid loss consumed?
I wouldn't say I think the best window is straight after. But it doesn't mean though that is the 1.5 litres that you're having immediately. I think it could be an initial 500 mil of fluid with electrolyte, and then just progressively across the rest of the day, trying to make sure that you're achieving that 1.5 litre target. But don't have it, if you just suddenly drink 1.5 litres of water within an hour, again, you're just going to flush that out and probably be more dehydrated the other side of it. Monitor that yourself through, like I said, your body mass. Is it getting back to normal? And also just your urine colour as well. Is your urine still looking quite dark? Or is it getting back to being a bit clearer? And that's probably giving you an indicator that, you're back to where you should be.
Okay, before we move into the protocols for heat training, is there anything on the safety front that we haven't talked about yet that we should discuss?
We've discussed like the different equipment to monitor core temperature, and kind of safe limits with core temperature. And we've mentioned the kind of perceptual, which is really important.
Hydration.
I guess, we said hydration. I guess the other thing is just actually being aware of like what is the difference between, say, heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So heat exhaustion is just like, a very high core body temperature, very elevated heart rate. You're probably very uncomfortable, you're very hot, but it's not life-threatening. Exertional heat stroke is this central nervous system impairment where stuff is leaking out the stomach and it's getting through the brain blood barrier, and it's causing, we notice that in terms of the change in coordination, change in behavior. Someone's probably unaware that they're, quite in an unsafe place. And we've seen that in marathons and triathlons with Jonathan Brownlee, Callum Hawkins, where those famous videos of them kind of swaying so they lose that coordination. So I think from a safety perspective, I'd try and say any heat training you're doing at home, try and have, a family member or someone aware of it's going on and be available. Because if they notice a change in your behaviour or see a loss in coordination, like, God, why are you stumbling all over the treadmill? I think it's having that someone there, or someone, again, I've had some stories where people have done a hot bath at home and they've got to a place where they can't physically get out of the bath. So if they didn't have someone there to supervise them and be aware of them and know them personally and know their behaviour, I think that's quite important. And the same goes to then if you're going to do a half marathon and it ends up being a hot day, maybe try and run with someone or run with a friend, because again, it's that change in behaviour that you will only spot, because they'll be unaware that they're kind of showing these symptoms.
And would it be safe to say that someone shouldn't try it without any way of measuring the core temperature? In other words, they shouldn't be guessing?
Shouldn't be guessing, no. because that, I know it's a perception's quite key, but it's those people that have that inability to notice they are that hot. Some people are really in sync with it, like, yeah, I'm very hot and the core temperature's hot. And some people are like, oh, I'm actually okay, but it's like, no, your core temperature's really high.
Okay, moving on to protocols for heat training. So we have the passive modalities like you talked about just now and the active heat training protocols. So on the passive front, is it mainly saunas and heat baths, or are there any other ways that someone can do passive heat training?
From a passive perspective, you could sit in an environmental chamber, but I think it kind of defeats the point of why people are doing passive strategies. They're doing passive strategies because they don't have access to an environmental chamber, but you could just sit in an environmental chamber. There's the passive from the training wearing thermal clothing, but that's more of a practical approach, but you're still having to exercise. But yeah, the two main ones are the sauna bathing and the hot water immersion. And in terms of protocol, we're doing that kind of post exercise generally. So we may have gone out and done our normal 10K, 10-mile run or track session, and it's immediately after the session's finished that we're then either going into a sauna or we're going into our hot water immersion bath. And again, hot water immersion bath's probably going to be a bath at home, and then the sauna might be a local sauna, or some people are fortunate to have a sauna in the garden. Um, and that's, yeah, trying to then be in that environment for at least 15, 20 minutes initially, but then building the duration up by 5 minutes each time to working towards where you're in it for maybe 40 to 45. So the hot water immersion is probably a little bit more tolerable to be in there up to 40 minutes. With the sauna, you may still only be able to tolerate 30 to 35 minutes, and that'll be quite individual. So it's, again, recommending people to trial each approach and see what they prefer and what they can tolerate. We were talking about that time. If you can only tolerate the sauna for 15 minutes, it's probably then not long enough for it to be a good enough heat stimulus.
Okay, for the hot baths, what temperature should the water be?
I like 39.5. So the literature tends to say like 40 degrees. And the reason for that is it's just, well, it's above our core temperature and where we want it to be. So we're always gaining heat from that kind of induction. So yeah, 40 degrees, but again, 39.5, that half degree doesn't sound a lot, but it will make it a little bit more comfortable, which means then you can sit in it longer.
Okay, I guess for the sauna, it's a bit difficult to measure because of the environment, right? Sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying something about the bath.
I think just, yeah, try and get a water temperature monitor so you can measure it. But you may set the water temperature a bit hotter initially because you may, as you'll notice at home, the water temperature will drop. And I've seen that in practice where it's difficult. Though we've done it where we've given someone a core temperature pill. They've gone out and done the session. They've raised their core temperature, the skin temperature, by maybe a degree, and then the bath is then just trying to nudge it on another half a degree and then clamp it there. But sometimes with the bath, as we've seen that if they didn't get hot enough during the run, the bath, because the water temperature is dropping, it doesn't then push core temperature on further. So it is difficult. So if someone's maybe got like a lazy spa jacuzzi, well, it's maintaining temperature, it's much more effective in that situation. Appreciate people may not have that, but it might be that you just actually I'd say kettle water, but obviously you don't want to burn someone and they're sat in there, but you may try and think of ways to kind of keep the water temperature elevated, because as soon as that water temperature drops, your core temperature will just drop with it.
Okay, for the saunas, is there a difference between using a dry infrared sauna and a steam sauna? You know, I'm in Finland, so part of the culture here is to have the steam saunas. You know, the one where you throw water into this basket of rocks that's heated and you get steam that comes out of it.
There will be a difference. And again, it comes back to your internal body temperature and your skin temperature. Like you're just trying to get whichever approach you're using, bath, sauna, infrared, or the kind of steam sauna, you're trying to get core temperature to 38.5 and skin to around 36. So whichever strategy does that and then keeps it there, go for that. So it might be what you prefer. And again, it's difficult because the core sensors, they don't work in that environment, so you can't measure it. The only way we've done it with people is they've kind of stuck their head out and then done the tympanic monitor and then what the temperature is. It's a way of doing it and just checking. Because I've had athletes that have done the sauna and they've been doing 15 minutes and I'm like, your probably core temperature should probably just skyrocketing, and then you just can't. It's not comfortable. You see, you're getting out. That's where the steam saunas are probably quite difficult, because I know in the UK our saunas maybe only go to like 80, 90 degrees, whereas I think in Finland they go maybe like 110.
Yeah, it can. Yeah.
If you can tolerate that for 30 minutes, then great, but that might be quite difficult.
On the active heat training front, could you outline a protocol for someone? Well, let's start with a short, simple protocol for someone that is wanting to dip their toes into heat training for the first time.
So yeah, like I've got different approaches for different strategies. So if it's the first time, you may just go with like a 4 to 6 days and just do that. Again, if you're thinking about a hot race, you might do that probably in the week before. So if your race is on the Saturday, you might do like Monday to Friday, do your active heat training and do consecutive days of maybe 60 to 75 minutes per session. Um, if you've got a little bit longer and it's maybe a bit more of a key race, you might split it over 2 weeks and do like 8 sessions. So do like 4 one week, 4 the next. And yeah, there's various different ways we can split and slice it. You may do over 5 weeks and maybe do like 2 to 3 sessions a week and like just build it up progressively that way, because you find that if you just drop into 4 to 5 days, you come Saturday and you're absolutely exhausted because you've given yourself another stimulus to recover from when you're probably trying to taper already for the race. So maybe just trial a 4 to 5 block away from a race and then see how you are for the weekend, see what it works, rather than trying to add something in that you've never done before right before quite an important race. Could be quite risky. Yeah, trial different strategies, see what works for you. Do you prefer the passive? Do you prefer the active? And how long do you have before the race? So some people might do their heat training like 2 months away from the race and do like a block of 8 across 2 weeks and then just drop into a maintenance. And I know we'll come on to the kind of like time course and delay. But that tends to be quite good if you do like an 8-day concentrated block and then just drop into like 2 to 3 sessions per week across 4 to 5 weeks. And then it means then right before the race, you're not having to do some quite intense heat training. So you've already, and we've seen this now actually with a lot of the elite marathon runners and elite 10K guys, is they're just doing saunas twice a week, just year round. Just it's now integrated into their training. So if they then do come to a key race, they're already partially heat adapted and maybe only having to do a couple of sessions to get themselves fully adapted.
Okay. And what intensity should the athlete be training at when they're doing a HIIT session? There is this conundrum, right? Are we looking at heart rate, which will be unsurprisingly higher, or are we looking at pace, power? How do we quantify all this so we know that we're not going too hard?
I'd say you've probably not been able to go off heart rate, so you probably want to go off pace. So yeah, within the first 1 or 2 sessions, you probably want to keep it quite low intensity, just because it'll be quite a tough, a hard stimulus the first few exposures.
Like a zone 1, zone 2 kind of pace?
Yeah, but you may, like I said, in those first 10 minutes, you might just do a 10-minute warm up, easy, zone 2 or zone 1. And then over the next 10, 15 minutes, you kind of split in between it being like a zone 2 effort versus then maybe like 30 seconds at like a zone 5, almost like a high intensity run. But then for the bulk of your session, you probably want it to be around zone 2. So you may set that off at like a rating of perceived exertion, and it's kind of like a somewhat hard or light. But I think that initial 15, 20 minutes needs to have some high intensity efforts in just to raise core temp. But then drop into a zone 2 effort, keep it light aerobic where possible.
And just let the heart rate drift, right?
Yeah, notice it so you know when where it goes up to. And then if you know what a zone 2 heart rate should be, you've kind of got that reference point of, well, as I'm adapting and seeing that come down for the same relative intensity. There's stuff around the literature will say like 50% VO2 max, but people won't know what that is if they've not had a lab test done. So I think I'd go off perception of effort and say keep it light aerobic for the bulk of it, but then having some hard efforts
To raise the temperature at the start.
Yeah.
Now, for someone that doesn't have any restrictions and they want to incorporate a very well built heat training block, if you were to design such a training block, what would that look like leading up to a goal race? Should heat training replace any of their normal training sessions during the week, or is it added on top? How do they balance the low and high intensity sessions versus heat sessions? And should they mix some passive and active heat sessions into that whole protocol?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've got like generic plans that we've kind of delivered to some elite athletes, but I think it's still really important to stress that they should be involved in the design of that plan. You kind of need to understand their kind of training history and what their weekly, training commitments look like, and for them to have trialed different strategies before. So some people who've done it where they just like some of the elite triathletes we've worked with just like to do a 5 days before the race on the Saturday. They don't want to be bringing heat training in like several weeks and months beforehand because they don't particularly enjoy it. So again, there's that individual. But I think from my experience and from what the literature's telling us, you want to be doing about 10 to 14 sessions, probably 2 months out from the race itself, and probably doing those over 2 to 3 weeks. It might be like, if we look at Monday to Sunday, you might do like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, have a bit of a break day, and then do like Thursday, Friday. And then you then drop into that maintenance period. Whereas then following kind of 2 to 3 weeks, you're just doing maybe 2 to 3 sessions. It could be passive in nature as well. And then in that week before the race, you maybe just do a reacclimation of like 2 to 3 sessions just to, because you're kind of going from like 0 to 100 over those 2 weeks where you're doing maybe like 10 sessions, and then you're trying to maintain that, but it'll still decay a little bit. So over the next 4 weeks, we might maintain it down from 100 to 70, and then our 3 sessions top ups take us back to 100.
Okay.
Rather than trying to go from like 0 to 70% in that kind of 5 days before. Whether it's active or passive, I think it's all different tools to achieve the same outcome. Go off what your preference is. So some people quite like doing the environmental chamber because they can self-regulate their pace. It's running, and they'll just swap out maybe like if they had like a 10k or 10-mile effort, we maybe swap that out. For some of the elites who maybe, some of them would do like a morning session and then finish their long run in the chamber with us. Some people quite liked the tempo, so they do like a double threshold day on a Thursday. They do the morning session, they do the evening track session, and then they come in and do a hot water bath after the track session.
Before we started recording, we talked about the work you do with recreational age group athletes. So if someone listening right now needs help designing a robust heat and hypoxic training program, they can reach out and work directly with you and your team at Leeds Beckett University or online. So I'll put the link in the show notes where they can reach you. So coming back, it can be layered on top of your training, right? What I mean is, if someone does a high intensity session in the morning, they can come back and jump on the treadmill or an indoor turbo and do a heat training session at low intensity straight after that. Is that correct?
It is an additional stressor. So I think if you're someone that, does 5 hours of endurance training a week, I think you do need to swap out, that if you're doing 3 hours of heat training, probably does, if that's active, it needs to replace 3 hours of your normal training. I don't think you can suddenly just go from being a 5-hour runner to suddenly now doing 8 hours because you've added 3 hours of heat training on. It needs to swap one for one. It needs to be treated as it could be a zone 2 effort, but it probably needs to be treated like a high intensity session from a recovery perspective.
Got it. So that means if you're doing a heat session today, you shouldn't be planning a high intensity session the next day. Is that correct? Okay? Let's quickly touch on how long the adaptations last. So you were saying that with different ways of formulating the protocols, the adaptations can last different lengths of time. So how should someone think about when they should do their heat training, how long it will last, and how to stretch it so they can optimize their race performance?
Are we referring though to heat acclimation here though? If you're trying to improve performance in the heat, like I said, minimum 4 sessions. You can kind of get away with 4 sessions, and that'll kind of get you around 70% adapted. So if you've got a race that's hot but not extreme heat, That'll be sufficient, but that'll need to be done over kind of consecutive days. And the benefits will last about 5 to 7 days. If you go from more medium term and do about 7 to 10 sessions, you may split that over 2 weeks and do kind of like 3 days on, 2 off, or 1 day off. So you're kind of thinking every third day you're doing at least a heat session.
Yeah.
And those benefits will last about 2 weeks. And then if you do about 14 sessions, again, I doubt you would do that like 2 weeks consecutive. You probably split that over 3 to 4 weeks. And those benefits will last about a month. But it's knowing that, yes, the benefits might still be there, but obviously over those 28 days, there'll still be a decay. But it's almost like short term gets you up quick, really, really responsive, but decays really quickly. Medium term, slower decay. And then, the long term is decaying at a much slower rate. And that's what you still maybe want to just do some top-ups to keep it elevated.
On the top-ups, how much is the maintenance dose per week to maintain those adaptations through towards someone's race?
Rule of thumb, you're trying to do one every third day. So you're trying to do 2 to 3 heat sessions per week to maintain that. Okay. So like I've done it before where I kind of put it into someone's plan that, so he's done like Tuesday, Wednesday, he's doing a passive session, and then all his other days are just normal training days. But we kind of done that in the context that he was then out in a hot climate, so he probably was getting in some passive heat just through his training outdoors. But about 2 to 3 per week is enough for maintenance.
Okay. Then, as we land the plane, let's bring this together for the listener. If a runner in their 40s or 50s is listening today, living a normal life, training 5 to 8 hours a week, have no access to an environmental chamber, no altitude facility, no lab, or any of the luxuries that pro athletes have at their disposal, what is the one thing they could do with regards to heat training that will make the most meaningful difference to their performance and health?
I really like the hot water immersion. So if you've got, a bath in your house, buy a tympanic monitor, they're relatively cheap, 30 quid, and start to just track your core temperature and start to integrate some hot water immersion post workouts. So just do your normal training sessions and try and integrate that hot water immersion, 2 to 3 times a week, and start to build your tolerance time and start to build up the frequency of those exposures. And again, comes back to perception. Make it so it's hot, it's uncomfortable, but not unbearably hot or not very uncomfortable.
I guess it gives us a very good reason to tell the spouse we need a jacuzzi in the house, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Are there any situations where you would tell a masters athlete not to bother with heat training, where the cost benefit simply does not add up?
I don't think so, because I think that there's a lot of benefits outside just doing it for performance. There's a lot of health benefits.
Yeah.
And also recovery benefits. So unless it's someone that's got multiple health conditions that would be prohibitive, related to cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, I think as long as we don't have those health complications, you should be safe to do some form of heat training. And that, that's why saunas are popular, because it's almost like a free endurance run. You can do it passively.
Yeah.
People do it in the gym.
Okay, and my final question to you, Daniel, is what does endurance mean to you?
Endurance. Say it's about resilience, to be able to test your limits and see how far you can push yourself, both mentally and physically.
Daniel, thank you so much for shedding light on the topic of heat training and making it more accessible to the listener.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.